My name is Helena Duncan. I wanted to firstly thank Scott, Michael, and Jim for inviting me to contribute to this really exciting project and for asking me to take part in this seminar, and also to all of the other contributors so far for giving me so much to think about. My presentation today is on Scottish female Renaissance writers, particularly Willa Muir, Nan Shepherd, and Lorna Moon, and considering how their writing from and of Scottish rural and semi-rural communities can problematize ideas of revival. What I would say at this point is that female Renaissance writers such as Muir, Shepherd, and Moon offer really nuanced depictions of rural and semi-rural Scotland and of the ways in which communities within these spaces operate. And this may seem like an obvious statement to make, but I think it is an important one. It's important to avoid a one-size-fits-all approach to the contributions of women writers, particularly within a discussion such as this one, wherein the aim is to foreground the importance of their work in problematizing the Renaissance canon. Their writing in different ways repositions the rural not as simply a space of kailyard, sentimentalism, and feminine domesticity, nor as the staunchly anti-urban space of authentic Scottish identity and culture that critics such as Sylvia Bryce-Winder have argued is central to the Scottish literary renaissance, nor just as what Douglas Gifford has referred to as spaces of fundamental sickness and narrow-mindedness. Rather, writers such as Muir, Shepherd, and Moon present rural communities as active sites of female rebellion, parody, and rebirth. As such, this presentation in a way is springboarding from the discussions in the last seminar about ways in which we can begin to decentralise Hugh MacDiarmid from discussions of the revival to instead foreground women writers' contributions and their approaches to the Renaissance, although having said that, he does still make an appearance in this presentation. As Juliet Shields raised in her seminar, there is still an undervaluation of women writers in discussions of revival. In 1923, the Glasgow Herald published an article titled A Scottish Literary Renaissance. In the article, it was said that Scotland, with her far stronger equipment in the way of national history, literature, and character, was capable of making a far more distinctive and influential contribution to current English literature than Ireland. Something infinitely ahead of the Whistle-Binkie order of things is represented by the very large group of contemporary Scottish writers headed by Neil Munro, John Buchan, Alexander Gray, Violet Jacobs, C.M. Grieve, Edwin Muir, Hugh MacDiarmid, and John Ferguson, to mention only a few of the more prominent names. The Herald's article lists, barring Violet Jacob, only male authors, and every writer listed had by this point been published by MacDiarmid in his poetry anthologies Northern Numbers, First Series, Second Series, and Third Series. Eileen Christensen has considered the way in which MacDiarmid's preoccupation with poetry as a higher form of art allowed the work of women novelists of the Renaissance to be discounted, and the Herald's mention of the listed authors being ahead of the Whistle-Binkie order of things refers to a series of collections of sentimental songs and poems emblematic of the kailyard, published in the mid to late 19th century, and is used in this instance to criticise the sentimental pastoral writing of 19th century Scotland. In many instances, female writers of the Renaissance were either compared to their male counterparts, overlooked, or their work misunderstood. Yet their work is crucial to an understanding of revival. And going back to Juliet Shields' presentation, she excellently summarised the second generation of professional Scottish women writers and their active participation in the aims of the revival. In Willa Muir's Mrs. Grundy in Scotland, Muir reflects on the ways in which Scottish imagination was long haunted by formidable women. They lurked in the anonymous ballads, they troubled the kirk, which was kept busy denouncing them as witches. They obsessed even Sir Walter Scott. And Muir's fiction, and Muir herself, can be read as an extension of such a tradition of formidable women haunting Scottish imagination and disrupting tradition. And in Muir's literature, it's most notably religious tradition. And what Muir does is to adopt the semi-rural space to highlight the intersections of broader cultural rupture and the conscious manipulation of what it means to be a woman in semi-rural Scotland. Muir's fiction specifically explores perceived internal threats such as the fracturing of a sense of community due to the rebellion of individuals. Furthermore, Muir explores how the breaking of rules such as those of sexual behaviour, which are built upon a religious foundation, can directly influence the ordinary moments of rural life. Both Imagined Corners and Mrs. Ritchie highlight the weight of watchfulness in rural communities, and it's a watchfulness that is often upheld by women. Muir indicates that it is this watchfulness that can maintain the traditions of what she refers to as the self-enclosed community of Calderwick in her two novels. This results in the attempted safeguarding of traditional gender roles, the continued symbiotic relationship between Calvinism and gendered and patriarchal structures, and a sense of entrapment in the underbelly of the Kailyard. However, these semi-rural spaces are sites of persistent rupture, and the structure of Imagined Corners reflects this. It's split into 3 books, and the novel's first book establishes the traditions of Calderwick and the rhythms of its community through a focus on gossip, religion, and the separation of rural life to the wider world. The second book, which is titled The Glass is Shaken, begins to disrupt these aspects of stillness and tradition, and Book 3 then sees a total disruption of societal atmosphere. Through the return of Elise Shand in Imagined Corners from Europe, an explicit questioning of Calvinism, with several female characters considering alternative philosophies and an expansion of sexual possibilities, the semi-rural space and its community is, for Muir, demonstrated to be a place ripe for re-evaluation, particularly for women, whilst the residue of tradition and the image of the peaceful rural is suggested to be failing women and withholding their potential. And although Muir's depiction of the semi-rural community is quite negative, there are examples of mini communities that begin to flourish within these overall claustrophobic structures. In both of her novels, there are examples of women forging their own support networks or philosophical discussions between themselves, engaging with women's suffrage groups, and women who are critiquing or mocking the traditions of the community they are within in their smaller mini communities. Moving on to Lorna Moon, her personal relationship with Scotland during the revival is contentious. She actively pushed against Scottishness in many ways. Despite the content of her writing, in private correspondence, she requested that she should be called a British novelist, lay off Scotland, and that marketing purposes shouldn't include thistles, heather, or barry. She also, in contrast to MacDiarmid's aims, actively avoided the use of Scots dialect, preferring to rely on idiomatic language. And despite this, a 1926 review of Doorways in Dromorty in The Scotsman determined that Moon falls victim to the curse of Scottish writers who cannot get away from tradition and meekly accept the stock figures and situations that have become accepted as typical. And Moon does consciously engage with aspects of tradition and Scottish literary stereotypes, but she is in no way meek in doing so. Her fiction is a compelling representation of semi-rural communities. Moon parodies the role of the neutral Kailyard narrator in her short story collection Doorways in Dromorty, and she creates tension between traditional community rituals and the sentiment of the narrator. Moon's narrator understands her characters really intimately, but she very rarely empathizes with them. In fact, the narration seems to welcome the downfall of those who uphold outdated idealizations of Scottish rural community. And instead, she aims to celebrate the women who attempt to critique, mock, or rebel against the community. And the reader, too, is encouraged to react in kind. An aspect of Moon's writing that I'm particularly interested in is in her representation of pre-war grief compared to interwar mass mourning, and her inference that semi-rural communities attempted to uphold what she wrote of as excessive Victorian-style grieving behaviours long after the point of national respectability. Her close depictions of semi-rural communities in these passages provide insights into gendered mourning, wherein communities rely on women for the public work of grief, and the interwar concerns of mass loss and how this translates to a semi-rural community, geographically distanced from many of the harsher aspects of the war. The indication is that by operating as separate communities, distanced from towns and cities and the people within them, these rural communities can become not only tactless but actively harmful. The parodic approach to a Kailyard-style narration critiques the Kailyard tradition and signals Moon's movement towards a more experimental modernist style in her only published novel, Dark Star. Her appropriation of Kailyard narration neither nostalgically reveres or sentimentalizes the rural Scottish past, but instead she's critiquing those who uphold it and who are restricting the potential for modernization. In a private letter to Lawrence Chambers in 1929, Moon declared that J.M. Barrie was a dear old whimsical bastard who would not have understood her protagonist in Dark Star. And while she once said that she wanted to write as well as Barrie, she is adamant that this should not mean that she writes like Barrie. Moon is also explicit that her protagonist doesn't belong to the Scottish heroines of literature, and she wants to distance herself from musty old shelves where women wore rats in their hair and became fallen. She continues on this note and makes it clear that her protagonist, quote, is 1929. So whilst Moon was not so actively engaged with the aims of the revival or with other writers of the revival's networks, and it is as such incredibly difficult to claim her as a Renaissance writer, her depictions of community and the impact of the semi-rural space on womanhood deserves attention and discussion. She begins to reclaim the rural space from the Kailyard and to explicitly question the ways in which women are able or not to navigate this space in a time of rapid change. Commentators such as Robert Macfarlane and Charlotte Peacock have wondered whether Shepherd's declaration that it is a grand thing to get leave to live might reflect a sensation of stasis on her part and an unfulfilled desire to leave Aberdeenshire and explore more of the world. However, Shepherd's reflections on infinity suggest that although she was based in Aberdeenshire, her spiritual outlook on the world focuses more on connections, widespread roots, and links rather than boundaries. And her writing constantly links the rural space to the urban, and her writing is forming a bridge between the Kailyard and the Renaissance. Shepherd's writing style garnered many positive reviews from other writers of the Scottish literary Renaissance, such as Neil Gunn, Hugh MacDiarmid, Agnes Muir Mackenzie, and Jessie Kesson, and literary critics. In the interwar years, Shepherd was described by journalist Coley Taylor as a novelist to put alongside Virginia Woolf, and in The Scotsman as a pioneer of narrative technique. In his introduction to The Quarry Wood, Roderick Watson has likewise commented on Shepherd's unique writing style as a creative triumph, which is all the more remarkable given that Shepherd's first novel, The Quarry Wood, was published 2 years after Hugh MacDiarmid's A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle, and 4 years prior to Lewis Grassic Gibbon's Sunset Song. And Watson's stance is that Shepherd's writing is such a triumph, largely due to her wry and humane vision, which utterly eschews sentimental naturalism, and she never once slips into Kellyard or polemical anti-Kellyard postures. Shepard veers away from sentimentality in favour of a form of interiority and self-awareness, which is central to the writing of many of the women writers associated with the Scottish literary revival, in regards to a search for personal self-determination. Combining interiority with the rural space, Shepard seeks both personal self-determination and national self-determination. When writing to Christopher Grieve, Hugh MacDiarmid, Shepard wrote that there is something to be said for seeing to it that the droves of youngsters who descend on the schools have at least heard that Scotland has a literature, and that a country's poets are much more significant than her press. Shepard was actively engaged in her personal search for self-determination, but also in safeguarding for future generations the production and education of Scottish literature. More than this, though, her writing, set in and focusing on the rural space, therefore aims to centralise the rural experience in the production and education of Scottish literature. Mirroring this discussion with MacDiarmid, in The Quarry Wood, Shepard parallels Martha's individual experience with the wider national experience, noting that while her universe was thus widening both in time and in space, Scotland grew wider too. Hitherto her own Blue Valley, the city with its spires and dirty trawlers, had been her measure of Scotland. Now it grew. The north came alive. There flocked in their hundreds her fellow students, grave, gay, eager, anxious, earnest, flippant, stupid and humble, and wise in their own conceits. Martha's experience here can be read to show that the broader the potentials for young women, and for those from rural areas, the broader Scotland becomes as a nation. Shepard certainly highlights the threads of national connection and argues for the protection of these connections between urban and rural spaces. Whilst Martha is at university, she is said to have no point of contact with her neighbours, or thought so. In this she was mistaken. The contact was there, though she did not feel it. The resistance towards the separation of communities in Scotland is something that Shepard brings up quite frequently, and instead she posits that each are interlinked, be that by the people or by more tangible facets of modernity such as transportation. As Alex Thompson put it in the first set of presentations for this network, revival is about the future, not the past, and it has to be distinguished from tradition because of the force of rupture. And in semi-rural literature by writers such as Muir, Shepard and Moon, we are held often in moments of rupture, both surrounded by the familiarity of tradition held in place, whilst the force of rupture thrusts these narratives into an unmistakably modern future. And so I wanted to consider just one or two more examples from Shepard's writing here just to close this talk, as her repositioning of rural and semi-rural Scottish communities is perhaps slightly more balanced than that of Muir or Moon's, in that there's a greater acknowledgement of the benefits of rural communities alongside the warnings of their restrictions. Shepard ensures that her characters are shown to have an awareness of the changing structure of society, but emphasizes the idea that rural communities are active sites for change rather than the canvases on which change is gradually painted. For example, in A Pass in the Grampians, Kilgo is dimly aware that such a period of growth was in being around him, that men were advancing from knowledge to knowledge at an incalculable pace, and that the relation between man and the great elemental background of his existence was changed. And there's a sense that there is a distinction between the speed of change and the speed that these changes are then able to be implemented. But nonetheless, Shepard isn't suggesting that these communities are left behind whilst urban areas progress. Instead, what she's suggesting is that they're actually at the centre of many of these changes and able to watch them happen, as well as implementing certain changes into their own lives. Just as, according to Eleanor Bell, Shepard's writing moves her into the centre of things, despite writing from a geographical and literary periphery. Like Muir, Shepard's fiction centralises the prominence of the watchful rural community as well. Shepard constantly reinforces the way in which reputation and identification are central to each person's place within society, which increases the likelihood of entanglement and the sense that the upholding of tradition within such a community is necessary. The opening line of The Weather House suggests as much. Shepard writes, "The name of Gary Forbes has passed into proverb in Fetarothny." This instantly establishes the relationship between individual action and community reaction, and the line hints at the duality of the individual, in that there is the person and then there is the way in which they are known within their community. It's not Gary Forbes, the war captain, who is now infamous, but instead simply the name of Gary Forbes. And for Shepard, a watchful community's points of interest both mirror those of the large changes in urban areas, but they also seek to preserve the natural. In A Pass in the Grampians, for example, Shepard emphasises the rootedness of rural residents to the earth, whilst not diminishing their own ability to be forces of modern change. In both texts, thoughtlessness, when combined with modernity, is for Shepard a credible threat to the environment and a sincere danger to the community. Similarly, a technique which Shepard frequently uses is to mirror moral virtue with a positive experience with the natural environment, whereas supposed moral decay is mirrored with the disease of nature. And in doing so, Shepard emphasises individual accountability, both for the environment but also for the positive continuation of a community. So watchfulness for Shepard's rural Scotland is seen to serve multiple purposes. It can be for punishment, protection, or the maintenance of normality. And in turn, whole communities are impacted. 3 years prior to the publication of A Pass in the Grampians, Shepard, in a letter to Neil Gunn, wrote, "I have a keen relish of the coarse, salty, vulgar life about me, and at the same time an intolerable intolerance of it. If one could combine the two, irradiate the common, that should make something universal." Shepard's attraction towards the removal of barriers is a further example of her stance that rurality and urbanity are not entirely separate. And Moon similarly noted in a letter that she wanted her work to have a message that transcends Scotland, though based on what I said earlier about Moon and her relationship to Scotland and the Renaissance, I would imagine that her approach to this is slightly different to Shepard's. So the work of Scottish female Renaissance writers writing of these semi-rural communities is precariously balancing between extremes. They sit between the cosmopolitan and the Kailyard and anti-Kailyard, between the shock of the new and a sentimental stasis, between a Scottish nationalism and the universal. But they are seen to have ruptured or are rupturing, and the semi-rural space is seen as an active site of change. And women writers are conscious agents of both positive change and careful preservation.